All right, welcome back to another video. Today we're talking about the heart and how the heart functions with its contractions, and we're looking at more at a cellular level here. Excuse me. So, to begin, we're going to talk about action potentials and cardiac muscle. So, let's look at two different types of cells here. Okay, so first of all, we have our autorhythmic. Actually, let me use red here. So we have our autorhythmic cells, and then we have our cardiomyocytes. Now, our autorhythmic cells are the cells that are going to kind of set the rate or the rhythm for the heartbeat, and the cardiomyocytes are the rest of the cells in the heart that are going to respond to those signals that are being sent by the autorhythmic cells. So if we're to draw this out, I'm just going to kind of draw this cell here. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to have these three cells drawn here. And this first one here is an autorhythmic cell. And in autorhythmic cells, we're going to have these channels that maybe we refer to as funny channels or HCN channels. And those channels are going to open as the cell becomes more negative, and they're going to just let in cations. So we're just letting in positive charges into the cell. So the more negative the cell is, the more of these positive cells that are going to be let in. Well, what's that going to cause? Depolarization, right? Because you have more positive charges coming into the cell. You also have, of course, like potassium leak channels. Okay, where potassium is going to be leaving the cell. And we have I guess I could just draw this here. We're going to have some sodium, voltage gated sodium channels. Okay, so when these positive charges are coming into the cell, that's going to cause the signal to be sent throughout the cell. It's going to depolarize the cell. These voltage gated sodium channels are going to open. We're going to have more positive charges coming in here, and that's just going to depolarize the cell. And because we have some gap junctions in between our autorhythmic cells and cardiomyocytes, they're all just stacked and connected together. And so with those gap junctions, we have some sodium leak channels, and you have a buildup of positive charges inside the autorhythmic cell, which is going to open these or it's going to facilitate a flooding of these sodium ions to pass through to the cardiomyocytes, and that's going to give us another BWOG. That's going to communicate the facilitation of depolarization in the cardiomyocytes. Okay. And then as these cardiomyocytes, right, which are the autorhythmic cells are going to make up like the SA node and the AV node that are going to send out signals to the heart. And the cardiomyocytes are the rest of the muscular tissue in the heart that are connected to those and receiving these signals. And they're all just kind of propagating along these cells like dominoes almost. And as as these BWOGs are sent through the cardiomyocytes, you have these voltage-gated calcium channels that are going to open and allow positively charged calcium into the cell, which, as we know, calcium is going to facilitate contractions and help to further propagate that BWOG along these cardiomyocytes. So that's how action potentials work with the SA node and the cardiac ventricular muscles. Again, autorhythmic, making up the SA node, cardiomyocytes, making up the ventricular muscle. All right. During each phase of the action potentials, we have these channels that are going to facilitate ion currents and membrane potentials. So I'm just going to draw this in a graph and show you the difference between autorhythmic and cardiomyocytes and the different channels that are involved. So when we're talking about I should have drawn these different colors. Oh well, I'll do this. Autorhythmic. This will be cardiomyocytes. So for autorhythmic, right? We're going to start close to around -90 down here. 0 threshold, let's say, is going to be somewhere here. And what happens is we're going to have in our autorhythmic cells an increase of a depolarization event is what's happening here. And that is because of our funny channels, or our HCN channels, that are, again, letting in all these positive charges. And that's going to bring us up to threshold. And for the autorhythmic cells, we're going to have, let me think about this for a second. Actually, let me back up here a second. So I believe that actually what's happening here, I don't know if there's calcium channels there or not, But really, what I want to change here is that these channels here on the autorhythmic membrane are oh, actually, no. Oh, yeah. I believe that actually these would be our calcium channels, right? And as the HCN lets these positive charges in, it opens these voltage gated calcium channels. So we have type L and type T. And then that's going to push sodium through these gap junctions, sodium leak channels. And then we'll have can't think of the word right now. Oh, let's see. We're going to have voltage gated sodium channels here. On our cardiomyocytes. Right, which is propagating these longs, action potentials. And then we have our potassium leak channels also, and voltage gated potassium channels that are on the cardiomyocyte membrane. So I'm going to show that in a graph here. For our autorhythmic, right, HCN brings the cell cell membrane to threshold, and then right here, let's see, I'm going to draw this as kind of action potential, and right here is going to be our T-type calcium channels that are opening, and then we have our L-type calcium channels opening here. And that is causing, the cell to become more positive. But then we have, at this point, we also have our voltage gated potassium channels that are opening and letting out a lot of calcium. And the more negative this gets, the more of those channels open, right? And then HCN. So all the potassium is leaving, and then HCN is, as it gets more negative, more of them open, which will eventually cause us to again depolarize and go back up. For cardiomyocytes, on the other hand, we're going to have our resting membrane potential, right? And then we're going to go up to the threshold because of the sodium that is coming into the cell, causing an action potential. And so we have our voltage gate, we have our voltage gated, I'm just going to write it like this, voltage gated sodium channels that are opening here, causing this depolarization to occur. And then we have something interesting here that happens. We have our ITO channels that are opening here, and these are potassium chloride channels. So they're letting potassium out of the cell and bringing chloride into the cell, which is why it starts to become more negative. And then we also have our ultra rapid potassium channels there, our rapid potassium channels here, our slow potassium channels here, and then IK1 potassium channels that really allow a repolarization to occur. And I'm going to explain this here in just a second, but we also have to keep in mind that we have L type and T type calcium channels that are also involved in cardiomyocytes that are involved with muscle contraction with our calcium. And so this is like a battle going on, right? So you have all these potassium channels up here that are trying to let potassium out of the cell. And then you have these calcium channels that are opening, and they're letting calcium into the cell. So you have positive charges leaving the cell and positive charges coming into the cell. And that's why you kind of have this plateau where even though you have this battle back and forth between charges, nothing's really changing there until you get here to your IKS and IK1 channels opening, and then that is causing these potassium to leave faster than this calcium is coming in, and these calcium channels may begin to close, and so now you have all this positive charges leaving, and that's why you come back and repolarize to get to your resting membrane potential. So that's how action potentials work between these two different types of cells and the channels that are involved in those ion currents. Now we're going to take a look at one of my favorites, and that is looking at the ECG or EKG and understanding how these readings are formed. So now that we understand, that we have our autorhythmic cells that are sending signals to our cardiomyocytes, which are depolarizing, causing muscle contractions, we can look at it from a bigger picture perspective. So, if I was to come in here and draw this heart, okay? We know that when we draw the heart, right, this is the right side, this is the left side. I'm going to put our leads here, right? Positive and negative. And we know that this area here is the right atrium, and I'm going to put the SA node just here toward the superior part of the right atrium, and then towards the more inferior, towards the apex of the heart, we have our AV node. Okay, so here's our ventricles, our atriums up here, and then we have our ventricles, right? So I'm going to draw this intraventricular septum forming the right ventricle, and then this is going to be forming the left ventricle. So what happens is we have you'll remember we have these HCN channels that are open when the cell is more negative, letting positive charges in, and this is sending these signals or these vectors out from the SA node in all directions. And as that's happening, the cells are depolarizing, right? So let's see here. So first we're negative in these cells, right? Positive on the outside. And then they begin to depolarize. So now we have these positive charges on the inside and negative charges on the outside. And when we're talking about cells in the heart, we're looking at the charges outside of the cell membrane. Okay, so in this case, we're looking at these cells here, these negative charges. And so when you have these signals being sent from the SA node, right, these cells are turning from positive to negative, and all of a sudden, you have all these negatively charged cells propagating this way. And if you look at those vectors spread it out across, the atrium, and you take an average, you see that the average vector is headed this way. Or let me draw it more like this. It's headed towards the AV node, okay? And you've got these negative charges on both atriums. And that is the portion of our so if we're drawing our graph for our reading on an ECG, what that would show is here what we call our P wave. We'll label that P right there. Okay, and the reason that goes up like that, okay, is because with these vectors, we have a negative tail because of this depolarization occurring throughout the atrium, which is causing the atriums to contract. And that means that the charges on the outside of the cell are, like we said, negative, right? And those negative, that gives this average vector, this big arrow, a negative tail, and it's headed towards a positive lead here. But if it was headed exactly towards that positive lead, then that wave would be a lot bigger. But because it's headed toward it, but not directly, it's kind of headed more out this way. That's what causes it to rise. So when it's a negative to a positive or a positive to a negative, that's going to cause the ECG reading to rise. Now, finally, all these charges, right? These positive charges, as these atriums are depolarizing, they reach the AV node. And the AV node hangs out for a moment, hanging on to these charges for a brief time, causing this kind of like little plateau right after the P wave, because there's no change at that point. We're not really seeing any significant change in the electrical reading. And then the AV node is going to begin to propagate. It's going to send these charges out, and these charges are going to reach these bundle branches. So we have our left bundle branch running here along the intraventricular septum, and then we have the right bundle branch on the other side. Okay, and those bundle branches are going to reach what we call the Purkinje fibers that are going to run up either side of the ventricles. Okay, but first we have these charges that are going to depolarize this region right here, superior, more to the left, superior area of the intraventricular septum, and it's going to send out action potentials like this, right? These vectors along the septum from left to right. And so if we take the average of that, these cells are, again, positive on the inside, negative on the outside. And so it's going to be, if we take our average vector, right, we're going to be seeing something like this, where it's not, this average vector is, it's headed towards the negative, but it's not, directly at it, and it's not completely away from it. It's not parallel to it either. And so we have a negative tail headed to a negative lead. And so that's going to cause this reading to actually drop down like this. and cause our Q wave right here, okay? So now both these bundled branches have been depolarized, and that's propagated down the septum. And then you have all of these Purkinje fibers that are running along the ventricles that are depolarizing this way out towards the epicardium. And so if you take your average, it's actually going to put you somewhere about right here. And that is going to give us a large wave, because you see we have our negative tail, right? Because it's depolarizing. So negative charges on the outside. Negative tail towards positive lead is going to give us a large wave up, okay? So I'm going to draw that as an R. That's our R wave. Now, because the left ventricle is slightly larger than the right ventricle, we're going to have this as, you know, the right ventricle is going to finish depolarizing, but there's still going to be this little area up here of the left ventricle that hasn't finished yet. And so once, you know, as we're sending these action potentials through these cardiomyocytes, it's going to cause this to kind of send vectors like this. If we take our average vector of these, it's going to put us somewhere about right here. I'm going to say something like right there, right? So we have negative tail headed towards a negative lead, okay? It's not headed to the positive down here. It's headed up kind of more towards the negative. That's going to give us, again, a small drop in our reading. And this is called the S wave. And then for a moment, right, we have our whole heart that's been depolarized. And now, boom, out of nowhere, right, we're going to have from our apex, I shouldn't say out of nowhere, but from our apex, from the epicardium to the endocardium, we're going to have a repolarizing of all these cells, right? Just going to spread throughout the entire heart, all the way back up to the atrium. If we take our average of that, we're going to be somewhere like this, okay? And now, since we're dealing with repolarizing cells, there's going to be positive charges on the outside, because the charge on the inside is going to become more negative. So if you have a positive headed toward a negative, remember that that's going to come up like this, just like our P wave. And this is what we call the T wave. So that's an ECG tracing, and that's how these different waves are made from the heart. So keeping that in mind, we're going to move on now to STEMI and NSTEMI and look a little bit about how those events occur in the heart. So if you asked me to explain to you what the acronym STEMI stands for, I actually wouldn't be able to tell you, but I can tell you that NSTEMI means not STEMI, and then STEMI just means STEMI. So let's kind of take a look here and see the difference between these two. So if we, I'll just do this. So if we draw a heart here, okay, and we have our aorta here, and then we have our left coronary artery, okay. So left coronary artery here, And this left coronary artery is going to be delivering blood to the heart. And with it, it's going to be carrying oxygen. And oxygen is needed to generate ATP that is needed for functions of the heart, okay? So we have these arteries that are going to be branching off the coronary artery, and it's going to be again supplying oxygen to the heart. Whoops, dang it. Okay, so if you think about this blood flow coming down, right? If you so NSTEMI and STEMI have to do with heart failure. And if you have some sort of blockage in the coronary artery, you're going to have blood that's flowing down here, but not as much as if it was functioning normally. And so as you travel down this artery, you kind of have like less and less blood that's coming through. And so if we were to kind of draw, like, you see, our ventricular walls here of the heart. Okay. Because these cells because like up here at the superior part of the heart, because it's receiving more blood, we have cells that are receiving oxygen. Like I said, oxygen is needed for ATP. And you know what? I'm having a hard time really trying to understand this. I think I don't understand STEMI and MSTEMI as much as I should, but if I remember correctly, I'm just going to kind of go with this. So we have decreased oxygen, which means decreased ATP. And if we have decreased ATP, that means we need the ATP to run the sodium potassium pump. And so if we don't have as much of that, sodium potassium pump is not working properly, which means that we're going to have a potassium buildup outside of the cell. And if we have a potassium buildup outside of the cell, less potassium is leaving the cell, and it's going to cause us to have these continuously sort of depolarized cells right here along the endocardium of the ventricular wall. And so while you have all these other areas where you have negative charges as normal, right, depolarizing cells, you have this one area here where you have these cells that are continuously depolarized, and they're going to be sending out vectors like so constantly. And that means we have so we have positive charges outside these cells, but these cells over here, they're constantly they're not depolarizing, and so they have positive charges outside. And if they're not depolarizing, then we're going to have an average vector that's something like this, which is going to be causing a negative to a positive. So, yeah, negative to a positive. So we'd expect an upward trend. Now, when we look at our EKG, right, we have our P wave, and then we have our and this is for NSTEMI, by the way. And then we're gonna have our Q wave, and we'll have, actually I'm just gonna kind of draw like what it should look like, right? So we have it first, and then when this happens, our NSTEMI, because it's continuous, and the EKG will kind of get rid of background noise. So this is known as the what is it? Background current of injury. That's this area here with all these cells that are not depolarizing. Because it's continuous, the EKG is going to set kind of this new baseline, which will be higher. And then it's going to give us a P wave, Q wave, R wave, and then the S wave is going to come back down to the original. I think so. Original baseline, and come back up, and then we'll have our T wave again up here. Did I explain that right? I hope so. Because if we think about it, right, like you have potassium that's not coming in, yeah, they have the buildup. So then for like STEMI, it would just be like the same thing but worse, right? So now we'd be looking at a heart that has, I think it would have, let me think for a second. I think maybe I drew that backwards. Let me think. Well, I guess if you have, wait, hold on. I need to think for a moment. I think I'm confusing myself here, but I just remember that, like, as the cells die, because the sodium potassium pump is not working properly, then your gradient of potassium inside and outside the cell is decreasing and kind of reaching a sort of equilibrium. So for STEMI, now you've had more cells that have died, which I guess would mean that they're more negative and they're not depolarizing. So you have, you know, all these negative cells here. They're sending out, you know, these positive charges on the outside because the inside's negative. Because you have this potassium that's leaving the cell. But you don't have more potassium coming in. And so as more cells die, you have these positive charges out there. And that's going to be I think I might have drawn this backwards. I think that this is actually what happens at STEMI, because you have positive charges leaving, so you have positive to a negative, which is going to raise the line here. But if we were to kind of raise the baseline, right? But if we were to go from a positive to positive in the end STEMI, then that would actually probably look something more like this, where our new baseline is down here. And then we have our P wave, and then Q wave, and then our R wave would come up here to the original baseline. And then we have S and T, like so. So for end STEMI, it would go down, for STEMI to go up. Maybe I have those flip-flopped. Probably need to go back and review that one a little bit better, but that's kind of what's going on. You know, we have this potassium that's leaving because we have a broken sodium potassium pump, and it's causing kind of equilibrium with the potassium. And these cells are just kind of stuck there. They're dying. And it's not good news. Heart failure is never good news. All right, moving on. So, if we're looking at inotropic, lusitropic, chronotropic, right? I'm going to talk about inotropic and lusitropic. Well, let's start with the beta 1 adrenergic receptor. So we have beta 1. So, let's see if I can remember. So we're going to have norepinephrine that's binding to these beta 1 adrenergic receptors on cardiomyocytes. And when that happens, we have this alpha subunit. I'll just abbreviate it as alpha sub. That's going to go and increase activation of adenylyl cyclase. And that, in turn, is going to increase CAMP levels. Who knew we'd go camping in physiology? And then that in turn is going to increase our phosphokinase levels. And phosphokinase is going to phosphorylate 4 different things specifically here. It's going to, I'm going to draw it out like this. So we're going to have phosphorylation of phospholambin. We're going to have phosphorylation of the RYR channels. We're going to have phosphorylation of troponin I. And we're going to have phosphorylation of L-type calcium channels. Something that we could also note here is that alpha subunit is going to interact with the L-type channel directly as well. And so when that happens, and phosphorylation of L-type calcium channels, we're going to open more of these calcium channels, which of course is going to increase calcium levels. And when we have higher calcium levels in our muscle cells, we know that means greater contraction strength. That same thing is actually going to happen when we phosphorylate the ryanodine channels. So when they're phosphorylated, we have more RYR channels open. And that is going to increase the amount of intracellular calcium. And that is going to increase contraction strength, just like we mentioned. And those are both referred to as inotropy. And then we have our phospholambin and troponin that we also need to take care of. So when those are phosphorylated, troponin I, we're going to have calcium that's going to fall off from troponin C, and that's going to cause more relaxation of the muscles, because if we don't have that calcium bound to move myosin out of the way, myosin's not binding to actin, so increased relaxation, giving us lusitropy. Same thing, same effect with phospholambin being phosphorylated. That's going to increase circuit pumping calcium back into the cell, which means we have more calcium going into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and out of the sarcoplasm, which is going to increase relaxation because we don't have the calcium out there to cause contraction. So faster relaxation or more relaxation allows us to contract quicker. And one other thing we should mention as well is that when we have increased camp, okay, increased camp is going to cause more HCN channels to open, which is going to send more of those action potentials like we talked about earlier, increasing our heart rate, which is chronotropy. And so norepinephrine in general is going to have the effect of increasing heart rate and all that good stuff. Acetylcholine will have the opposite effect, slowing down and decreasing heart rate. So acetylcholine, okay, acetylcholine is going to bind to, man, I'm just going crazy over here. These things are getting too long. Acetylcholine is going to bind to the M2 cholinergic receptors. And from there, we're going to have our beta, how do you draw this, gamma heterodimers. And also, we can't forget our alpha subunit. And our alpha subunit is going to, let me draw this a little bit better, decrease camp. Can you guess what that's going to do? Well, we're going to have less HCN channels open. So we just talked about how camp is going to open more with norepinephrine, but now with acetylcholine, it's going to decrease the HCN channels that are open, which will decrease our heart rate. We can also have the decreased camp interacting with or affecting the T and the L type calcium channels, decreasing those the channel activity for those, which will also lead to a decreased heart rate. And then for the beta gamma heterodimers, those are going to open the GERK channel, which will be the name of my firstborn son. And then we're going to increase, because of that, hyperpolarization. So the cell is going to become more negative as we are letting in negative ions, and that's going to decrease our heart rate also. So there you have it. Now let's get this thing finished up, because you're probably tired of hearing me talking about all of this stuff. Let's see. I'm just going to do this real fast. So if we have like our cardiac cell, essentially we have our sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? That's going to have our ryanodine channel, and we're going to have these voltage gated L-type channels that will open and let calcium in from T-tubules into the sarcoplasm, and that calcium is going to come and bind to the RYR channel, which is going to release a whole bunch of intracellular calcium into the sarcoplasm, right? And which is going to interact with the troponin, which is going to allow for muscle contractions. And then, again, we just have our circuit pump. That's going to take this calcium and the ICF, put it back up here into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And I think we also have some calcium pumps that will pump calcium out of the cell into the ECF as well as needed. And finally, as we talk about the cardiac cycle, the different stages, okay? This will be like our grand finale here. So we've already gone over all this stuff. Let's kind of wrap this up. So, better draw this nice and good. That's not very good. You know what? I'm just going to make it easy on myself. There we go. And let's take this, rotate it like this a little bit. Do that. Copy it. Oh, snap. I didn't mean to do that. Paste. 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 All right. Let's see. Should have done this before I did this. Right. So, we're going to move from the right atrium to the left atrium. Mine's the right side, it's the left side. All right, basically what's going to happen is, we're going to have high pressure up here in the atriums and lower pressure down here in the ventricles. And these valves, right, tricuspid, bicuspid, are going to be closed as the pressure builds up top in the atriums. Then pressure is going to be high enough to open these valves, which is going to let blood start pouring in here and fill up the ventricles, okay? And as that happens, we have blood, blood that starts to fill up in here. And so now you have pressure in these atriums that are decreasing, and little by little the pressure in our ventricles begins to go up as it fills with blood. Then we're going to have contraction of these ventricles. That's going to cause our bicuspid and tricuspid valves to close again, because now we have this rising pressure in the ventricles. And as that pressure rises, because it's filled with blood, pressure from the contraction, then what we'll see is the semilunar pulmonary and semilunar aortic valves are going to pop open, allowing blood to leave here. And let's see here. Then you're going to have your aorta coming out, right? And when this blood's coming up through the aorta, shooting up here, it's going to cause the aorta to stretch a little bit. And it's going to push a ton of pressure out here, right? High pressure to push enough to the body. And I should mention that the pressure in the right ventricle is lower, a lot lower than the pressure in the left ventricle, because the right ventricle is going to be pumping blood to the lungs. It doesn't need a lot of pressure to get there. But for the left ventricle, that's going to be pushing blood to the rest of the body. And so this is super high pressure. And then after it's pumped it out, after a few seconds, or I don't really know how long it is, but blood is going to start to kind of ricochet back down and close these valves again, right? So this aortic valve will close, and the same, what happened with the pulmonary. And then the cycle will begin again and repeat. One thing else that I'll mention is with the opening of the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, this is our lub sound. And when the semilunar valves open, it's when they close. So when our bicuspid and tricuspid valves close, that's our lub sound. And when the semilunar valves close, that's our dub sound of the heart. And that's kind of the gist. I mean, of course, we can play around with the numbers, and some equations as well regarding the pressures. But this is essentially the basics of the pressure changes and opening, closing of the heart and the sounds of the cardiac cycle. So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it wasn't too boring. Sorry, I kind of got tripped up on a couple things here, but anyway, we'll see you next time.